Hello, this is Game On and I'm Adam Rosser, and this week I'm going to introduce you to Cozmo. It says on the Anki website, that's A-N-K-I for those of you with a lexical mind. Cozmo is a gifted little guy with a mind of his own. He's a real-life robot like you've only seen in movies, with a one-of-a-kind personality that evolves the more you hang out. He'll nudge you to play and keep you constantly surprised. Cozmo's your accomplice in a crazy amount of fun. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? So after you've dropped £449 on the Xbox One X and £500 on that 4K ready TV, you can then go ahead and spend £200 on Cozmo. Andy Robertson runs the Family Gamer TV channel on YouTube. Hello, Andy.
Hello, how you doing?
Not too bad, Andy. Andy, we first met Anki when they were producing Overdrive, didn't we?
Before Overdrive, they just had Anki Drive, which was the first iteration of their robot car racing. I usually describe it as kind of Scalextrics without the rails.
Because the little cars follow the track, and then in Overdrive they can battle with each other in a limited kind of way, and you control it all through smartphones, don't you?
Yeah, so it's quite clever because the smartphone is the kind of the brain, which means the cars all know where they are, and so you can do things like virtually drop a mine on the track or accelerate or do cornering and do stuff in the virtual world as well as in the real world, and it has that kind of back and forth, and you also get the cars talking to you on the phone as well, which is quite cute.
This is the thing I didn't get, being a bit thick. When I talked to Mark Palatucci, who's one of the co-founders of the company, and we'll hear an interview with him in a couple of minutes, I did not understand that the device, the robot, lived on the phone. I thought that it lived in the cloud, or it was in the little device, and I should have twigged to the fact it was on the phone, shouldn't I?
Well, you see them working, it's hard to know where the clever stuff's going on, and in some ways it doesn't really matter. I guess what's clever is that the Anki are using the power that we've already got in our smartphones to drive a game. And I guess it adds a bit of robustness, because if you had all that tech in the car itself, they go quite quick and they bash into each other and fall off the track and stuff. So the cars need to be quite strong. And if you've got that tech in there, it's going to be vulnerable to braking.
It's a very good point. If we're playing Blur with actual cars, that's going to be a real problem for definite. Mark is based in San Francisco with the rest of the team. You've been there a couple of times. We'll talk about that after we hear from Mr. Palatucci. When we spoke, I asked what the path was that took them from these little cars to a robot like Cozmo.
We're a consumer robotics company. We've been really focused the last few years on taking, a lot of the science of robotics and artificial intelligence and bringing them into consumer products. Overdrive was our first product, and our goal is to continue to build and make smarter and smarter consumer products. And the next step for us is Cozmo. And Cozmo is it's a smart, intelligent character. He comes to life. He can play different games with you. You can interact with him. And we really designed it to be almost like a pet that anyone in the family, whether you're a kid or if you're an adult, can really enjoy and get to know.
The way it's described in some of the promotional material I've seen is that it talks about being an AI device. How much is it using resources on the cloud to actually interact with people?
It doesn't use the cloud at all. It's just the robot itself and the smart device. The robot is not connected online, and neither is device. When you're connected to the robot, your phone or your tablet is not connected to the internet either. So everything happens just between the robot itself and the phone. So all of that intelligence we utilize through the app, so you can download either iOS or Android, and that's what allows him to really have such incredible capability.
To what degree are you facilitated by the fact that since you've been working with Overdrive, which is a very small car unit, and now you're scaling up to a much bigger device, how much freedom has that allowed you to put more smartness, if that's even a word, into Cozmo?
I think the main thing is really utilizing the smart device that the user has, whether it's a phone or whether it's a tablet. Those are pretty powerful devices. They have typically a gigahertz chip and gigabyte of RAM, and we can put quite a lot of intelligence in terms of recognizing objects, recognizing faces, or the environment, and a lot of that happens in the background on the phone, and the robot itself can perform and really come to life, but it wouldn't be possible at this type of price point without really utilizing the app.
The smart in the way is the smart in the phone, and it's mediated through the Cozmo.
That's right. I mean, this type of technology, a few years ago would really cost thousands and thousands of dollars. And to put this type of sensing and, this type of AI into a consumer product, really we wouldn't be able to do it without taking advantage of the smartphone.
In your eyes, then, is Cozmo kind of an evolution of the process that began with the Overdrive cars?
Yes, we call it the bottoms-up approach to robotics, but the idea is that the company is building a robotics platform that will allow us to build increasingly sophisticated, applications of robots for consumers. So with Overdrive, that was our first product. We've taken, everything that we've learned and all of the technology that we've built, we've applied it to Cozmo, which is something wildly different. We added some pretty strong capabilities in computer vision. The robot itself has a better understanding of its environment, can dock with different objects. It can play with cubes, and really the biggest component is the personality. We've hired an entire team of animators from feature film houses like Pixar and DreamWorks. We've really worked hard to think about the character, think about his needs, his background, his aspirations, and really done a lot of work to bring that character to life. I think that that's an evolution for us, and I think in everything that we do going forward, that character and bringing that out in all of our robots is going to be something that's incredibly important.
Is that kind of narrative about what the device is, who the device is, something that's been missing from consumer robots, do you think?
I think it's just an evolution, and I think we're very much in the early days of this industry, building these types of smarts and these types of capabilities into products. And I think really adding those character elements, things that make them more lifelike, more or human-like, and really more relatable, creating that type of empathy. That's something that we're starting to really scratch the surface on that, and I think that that's really just the natural evolution of these types of devices.
It is amazing the number of things that a human will look at and say, that thing has a face, therefore that thing is in some way sort of quasi-sentient, isn't it? And it's amazing the amount of how quickly people invest a device with personality.
Our animation team spent countless hours really just focusing on a lot of the subtle nuances like the eyes or, some of the movements of the head, things that you don't really realize, how much depth it takes. And, something like how often he gazes at you. The robot will, see a player in the environment and will occasionally turn back and kind of move his head up and glance at you. And just making eye contact more frequently ends up having a huge impact on the bond between with the player.
And you started the sort of road to robotics at Carnegie Mellon back in 2005, and here you are talking to the BBC about a robot that lives in people's home. That is a very fast set of evolutions, isn't it?
6 years of a PhD doesn't feel fast sometimes. We started the company when we were finishing up our graduate work. In many cases, actually ended up being a lot more fun to work on the company and our first product, Overdrive, than kind of finishing your thesis research.
As part of that PhD that you were doing at Carnegie Mellon, you were working with Intel. Now, is there a demand, a pressure almost from the chip makers for people to push the envelope of what can be done with their products? Is that part of the way that they look at what researchers are actually doing?
If you look at a lot of hardware companies in Silicon Valley, Intel is one, certainly, NVIDIA, you see a very big trend to actually try to take a lot of AI and machine learning and actually miniaturize it and, put it on chips. And I think one of the things that you'll see in the not too distant future is hardware devices like mobile phones having dedicated and super specialized AI chips that will allow them to do things that are, much more powerful than, typical cell phones with kind of the generic processors that they have today.
You mentioned NVIDIA there, and they have a very interesting thing on their Ansel platform, which is the photo-taking part of their software setup that comes with all their new GeForce cards. It basically learns from pictures you give it, and it then applies the art style it sees in a picture. I use the word sees, obviously, in a sort of that quasi-humanizing an algorithm kind of way, and then applies it to an image that you've given it. So you can end up with sort of Witcher 3 by way of Turner. That's that odd confluence of an idea which is allowed for by the amount of sort of headroom that there is on a processor, isn't it?
At Anki, we're always looking at, the hardware landscape. And, when we think about our products, we only really look roughly 3 years out. It's very, very hard to predict, what's going to be available in hardware, 5 years from now or 10 years from now. I mean, the landscape changes so quickly. So, we're constantly trying to keep tabs on, new types of sensors, new types of chips. We look across all the big manufacturers, and, really when we think about our next generation products, we look at really what's coming out today and within really the next 12 months.
What's the most aberrant response you've had from a Cozmo to a set of inputs when it's been being tested through? Has one ever really surprised you?
No, it's never happened. No, there is one thing that pops into mind. We had a person, one of our employees had a kind of a paisley shirt, and the robot took one look at it and kind of went into a little bit of a tailspin, and it turned out that Paisley kind of overloaded one of the algorithms that was kind of processing some of the vision. So we corrected that, but I didn't. It kind of teased this person about their shirt kind of crashing the robot, but.
Yeah. I ask that because you're at the sort of soft end of AI and of robotic AI, and at the hard end of that, there is a whole set of questions about autonomy in devices like drones, and I think you probably have answered questions about this in this period. What's your feeling with regard to sort of those kinds of questions? And the Paisley is sort of an object lesson of something that happens at the softer, less sort of belligerent end, but there are going to be a lot of questions asked at the harder end about what we can do with AI at the moment, and indeed what we should be asking of AI.
I mean, we take a very optimistic view of it. I mean, if you look at the products that we're making, it's really about fun. It's about, creating a relationship between, a human and human player in this device. We're very optimistic in how this type of technology can really, change product categories and make them, significantly better than what we've seen before.
Do you think that that's something that is happening? People are becoming more willing to accept these kinds of devices into their homes?
I do. I mean, if you look at voice recognition, which for decades has been one of the most challenging problems in, artificial intelligence. I mean, the progress that the community has made in the last few years has been remarkable. And, I wouldn't say it's a solved problem per se, but especially in, embedded devices, but it's made tremendous progress. And I think, if you look 5 years out from now, there's no doubt that, voice interfaces are going to be completely commonplace in, all of our devices. And I think that's a good example of something that, originally people thought as like a really big, hard AI problem, and I think will just be very natural and normal in a few years.
It was a big, hard AI problem when AIs lived in big, hard mainframes and weren't able to be exposed to a lot of people. But now, as you rightly pointed out, I've got a smartphone in my hand. They've got a desktop computer which could probably very easily be wired to actually listen to me rather than just take an input from a keyboard. And then there's the internet and the way that the data can be shared and harvested, and algorithms can be manipulated on the fly. You no longer have to have a software engineer comes over and changes something. You can just do it remotely. This is a kind of a confluence moment, isn't it, where all of these things are operating on one another to allow new objects, new procedures, new approaches to appear.
I think what you're really talking about is the ability to deal with unstructured environments, which has been, an area of research, within the robotics community for many years. And I think you're starting to see the point where we can adapt. I mean, if you look at Cozmo, he's, the table and objects on the table, he might plan a path that, an hour later or, the next day is totally different. And, he's able to build a map of his world and navigate around these different environments. And I think that's something where, when you compare it to industrial robotics, where, an industrial robot, that's been in a factory, typically has to repeat the same action hundreds of thousands of times incredibly precisely. But, it only works because it's a, fully structured environment. But I think the real advances recently over the last few years is dealing with, the uncertainty of the real world and dealing with, particularly in, home robots or, consumer robots, that's a challenge that I think we're only really, being able to deal with. And, that type of tech is really what we've been able to bring with Cozmo. Robots
in your home, robots on the roads, robots all around us, really, aren't there?
Yes, and we hope for many more. Our goal is really a robot in every home.
That sounds rather marvellous. And then, as a reader of the 2000 AD comic, I also find myself thinking, should I be slightly afraid? What do you think?
Again, I'm very optimistic. I think when you see how difficult it is to actually make a lot of this stuff work, you realize that kind of the doomsday scenarios that some folks dream about are really not possible. So it's when you're in the weeds trying to actually get the robot to pick up a block or navigate an environment, you still realize how far the field has to go, and also it's really all AI is just objectives and constraints. It's still a human that has to program those objectives. So the idea that the robot's going to just do something nefarious, spontaneously, that's something that's not feasible.
My British pessimism is not going to be able to dampen your enthusiasm for these things, no?
So I guess a little American Silicon Valley enthusiasm.
That's Mark Palatucci from Anki. Now, Andy, from its launch, it says on one of the press releases, Anki's grown from 3 founders to over 160 employees and has received over $200 million in funding. It doesn't actually tell me how many they've sold or anything like that, but I'm assuming it must be profitable. The robot toy business is quite an established one, isn't it? Although these toys are a lot smarter than most of the things that call themselves robots, aren't they?
Yeah, I guess you can call anything a robot these days, and that isn't necessarily true. And then in terms of the sales, they don't publish figures, but they've been sort of sitting at the top of the Amazon Christmas toy lists in terms of how many they've sold for the last couple of years. And at times they do sell out. So it's definitely, there's a big appetite for their product. And I think that's because it kind of delivers on the promise of being kind of robotic and futuristic in a way that some other products don't. So the sort of the level of technology they've got, the lengths they go to create the characterization and the kind of the game experience. When you go to the offices, you realize it's no accident that it's a good experience. They really double down on it.
You actually can play a game with Cozmo. You can do a thing where there's pattern matching, because the other thing that comes in the set, and this is beginning to sound a bit like an advert for the company, but that's regrettably how these things tend to go. The thing is that you play a matching game. These 3 blocks make sort of a sequence of noises like Simon Says, that old game. And you have to follow them, and so does he. And then he fails, and he gets annoyed, and the animation of the eyebrows changes. And they're doing an incredible amount of work with a very small set of visual cues, aren't they? I mean, he sort of shifts backwards and forwards sometimes when he's frustrated and lifts his lifter up and down, and then the eyes change. But you invest it with an incredible amount of personality, don't you? It's very strange how quickly you do that.
The tension here is obviously, like you said, the cost. And that's the risk, I think, for Anki, that because some of the things that they're offering have been done before. We've had robot toys, we've had Simon Says games for years and years. And really, at a very base level, that's all that is. But where they're innovating is in the characterization, and it's that ability to give the sense that Cozmo is a toy that actually wants to know and relate to you that I think is where they're succeeding. So there's a moment that I always remember where Cozmo has a need to make eye contact with you. And so there's a register within the robot that if he hasn't got eye contact, he looks around and looks for your face and recognizes you. He'll then be happy and go off and start doing something like stacking his blocks or playing a game. But as he does that, his connection register goes down. And at some point, it goes so low, he gets in a panic and has to check to see who's watching. And it's very much like a young child that they go off and they play. They'll stop what they're doing, check that mum and dad's there, and they are there, then they carry on. And it's that kind of almost human-like sort of personality that I think makes Cozmo worth the price of entry, really, and that's what you're paying for.
There's also the code lab part of this, which is where you can give him instructions in sequences, and they've broken it down into blocks. And we're seeing that approach to coding for younger people. That's happening quite a lot, isn't it? There's sort of pre-finished systems that allow you to fit things together to make games, because some of the games I saw at the BAFTA Young Gamers Awards were built on those kinds of systems. This is quite a well-trodden road, isn't it?
It is. It's a popular way to get kids into programming, and it feels like almost any toy needs to come with some sort of add-on that lets you in on how they developed it. I think it's interesting with Cozmo because you're not only telling the robot to move forwards or backwards, you're actually accessing that personality. So you kind of can set up Cozmo in your program to react in a certain way to people, but then it executes that through the movements and the personality and the expressions of Cozmo. So you're kind of getting access to some quite in-depth robotics here. It's not just about like Big Track. I remember when I was a kid, forward 5, left 5, all that sort of stuff. You're actually getting a robot that's going to be influenced by how he feels about something. Going back to visiting the offices, something I hadn't expected to find there were people working who had a background with Pixar, with orchestral scores on sort of main console games. And I think that when those elements come in as well, you get a sense that it's almost like a film character they're seeing Cozmo as. And that's the kind of the level of talent that they're hiring, which is, I think, why it gives that feel. And there's lots of things happening. There's sound coming from Cozmo himself, but also there's sound kind of flooding the area that comes from the phone. much in the way that a video game soundtrack will respond to what's happening. That sound that comes from your phone reacts to how Cozmo's feeling. So it's like the more you look at it, the more levels are going on. But it's all stuff you don't notice. You just react to him because of the good job they're doing.
What about the Toys to Life market? Because is Cozmo going to crash into that to an extent, do you think?
I think it's more like a toy in its own right. But I think it's quite clever that it does use video game stuff. So the experience of playing Cozmo, and in particular playing the Overdrive games, is very much like a video game. You've got that progression, you've got that soundtrack, there's a campaign mode, you have characters that you unlock, and there's a whole story. It draws on those things, but it never, because you only buy it once, it doesn't have this kind of slightly commercial feel of this is a toy that's just really a key to unlock stuff. And I think that's where we've seen the waning of the sort of Toys to Life market at the moment. And I don't think it's dead by any means, but I think we're taking an in-breath while we work out how to do that in a bit more of a genuine way. And perhaps Cozmo's a bit ahead of his time, and an Overdrive, that is the value there is ongoing, and you don't have to keep making multiple purchases.
Which is a big point. You could say to yourself, well, I'm going to buy the Lego Dimensions starter sets, and then it's, well, you're going to get the Lego Dimensions Year 2 starter or refresh set, and then there's the kits to add on, and you could be dropping quite a lot of money. But unfortunately, we now know that the sort of road has run out for Dimensions, hasn't it?
Yeah, so I think Dimensions is officially, there's going to be no more. Obviously, it still exists, and I think it's quite good opportunity to get some really quite good deals, particularly Black Friday coming up, on Lego and on that Look at Dimensions experience. I still think it's a great way to play a Lego game, and Disney Infinity obviously before that. And we're kind of waiting to see what Skylanders is going to do. Obviously, they've got a TV show now, and it's by no means stopped, but we're not having a new game this year, and so it'll be interesting to see how that develops.
So here's a question, though. Ingress. I spoke to the guy who created Ingress, the AR game where you went around and you attacked and controlled siphons of energy in the world. I asked them at the time at Niantic, I said, well, where's the money coming in? And they're like, we don't care about the money. Money's not important. We're just making a game. It will be monetized a bit later on, a couple of years down the road. Lo and behold, the money comes in when it becomes Pokemon Go. So I find myself looking at Cozmo and thinking, Cozmo, Toys to Life, really powerful computers on phones. The computers inside our consoles are more powerful yet still. And I'm finding myself wondering, is somebody at one of the big games houses looking at Cozmo and saying to themselves, how do I make that live inside a game or talk to a game or something like that? Do you think that's happening? Do you think some bright spark is having that thought?
I think the way that would go is really seeing what Anki have done with Cozmo and with Overdrive, and then bringing a franchise into it. Because I think the level of expertise there, unless they were looking to buy Anki, and bring them in-house or something like Microsoft or someone might do, I think it would be too hard to replicate, which is kind of why Anki as a business is quite robust. And I think that's why they've seen such good investment, because what they're developing no one else is doing of this quality, and that kind of gives them some protection against sort of copycat stuff. Because they're delivering at a high level, it's hard for anyone to compete with that. And of course, we've seen with Overdrive, they brought in the Fast and Furious franchise this year, so that's just coming out I think in the UK in time for Christmas, and that brings in their film and those characters and cars to match in a way that's a first for Anki, and I think we'll see more of that from them.
There's going to be that kind of synergy rather than sort of a takeover or a co-option.
Yeah, I think it's hard to get that back into video games. Once kind of the cat's out of the bag and it's a physical toy, then it is kind of a separate thing. And I think what's more likely is, and that's what you're seeing, is that video game talent and creators are coming across into companies like Anki and actually bringing those video game experiences, but in a physical form of robots or cars.
So, Andy, for you, does Anki feel like a company that's riding a fad or is making a market and is here to stay?
It's easy to sort of feel like it's a bit faddy, but actually I think because of the level of what they're doing, that investment in characterization, and they've got this long-term plan, I feel like they've got a future. Where that future takes them will be quite interesting. There's lots of opportunities, both in games and some of the robotics they're developing. They're getting interest from research universities and even sort of medical uses of some of their robotics. So it feels like it's hard to know where it's going to go, but it's certainly not a fad. It's not cheap at the moment, but I think you get a lot of value from it. So that's usually my advice to parents. Make sure your children are going to play with this sort of thing and it fits. But if it does fit, then this is a good one to buy.
And don't be afraid, it's just a small robot that likes to play with blocks. Andy, thank you very much.
Thank you.